Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Aline Saraiva Okello. I'm the Global Network Manager for the Rural Water Supply Network, and it's our great pleasure to welcome you to the first webinar of our late webinar series entitled Demystifying System Strengthening in WASH. So this is a webinar that comes from the collaboration that we have now with the Agenda for Change. So RWSN and Agenda for Change are strategic allies, and we are working together to promote more knowledge sharing and improve capacity in the WASH sector. So today we'll hear from members of Agenda for Change and RWSN on the topic of system strengthening. What does it mean? How does it work in practice? And what are some of the challenges and solutions that we have from practitioners? So if I can have the next slide, please. So we would like to start with a poll. So you should have now on your screen, sorry, wrong poll. Just a minute while we get the tech working. So we'll get started with poll number, oh, sorry. Okay, poll number 1. About how familiar you are with system strengthening. How familiar are you with the concept of system strengthening in the WASH sector? Very familiar, somewhat familiar. You heard of it, but it's still not so clear. And this is completely new to you. So please have a vote so that we can see who we'll be talking to during this webinar. So results are now coming in. So far, it seems most of you are somehow familiar or very familiar with the WASH systems. I'll give just a minute for others to respond. All right, so I will now end the poll and share the results. So I can see 43% of our audience today is somewhat familiar with system strengthening, 28% very familiar. And we do have 18% that has heard of it, but still not so clear, and 11% that is completely new to the concept. So welcome. I can see we have kind of a divided audience. So we hope all of you will learn something from today. If we can move to the next slide. I would now just like to go a little bit over some guidance. So this webinar has interpretation facilities. So it's we have interpretation in French and Spanish. So if you hover on your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a globe called interpretation. If you don't see it, you might have a button that says more. Please select that so that you can select your interpretation channel for the rest of the webinar. And then next slides. Also, in terms of housekeeping, this session is recorded, so the recording and presentations will be shared after webinar. Please continue to introduce yourself in the chat box. You can say your name, organization, and the country you are joining from. Please, questions addressed to the speakers, you can put them on the Q&A box in Zoom. So that is a box that is also on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And feel free to share comments in the chat box. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a short survey. We'll greatly appreciate if you can fill out this survey because it helps us improve our next webinars. Welcome. I see people from South Africa, Ghana, UK, Colombia. Welcome to all. So next slide, please. So the agenda for today, we are just doing the welcoming now. I'll hand over shortly to Bethlehem Mengistu from Agenda for Change, and she will be doing the opening remarks. And then we'll hear 3 presentations, one from Irene Gay on organization and program journey to adapting to system strengthening. Then we'll hear from Muti Njema from Baseflow Malawi, and he will be talking about challenging assumptions, bridging the gaps between philosophies in system strengthening. And finally, we'll hear from Tripti Ray from Oxfam, Nepal, and she'll be discussing the experience strengthening locally led rural water systems. After this, we'll have another poll and then Q&A. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to engage with our speakers, ask you questions. So please remember Q&A button for the questions that are addressed to the speakers. And then we'll have closing remarks and we'll end our webinar. So without further ado, next slide, please. I'd like to introduce Bethlehem. So Bethlehem is the global coordinator of Agenda for Change. She's a long-time global WASH expert with extensive experience in building collaboration, partnerships, and systems approach. She's currently a global coordinator of Agenda for Change. She has over 20 years of experience in the development sector and deep knowledge of African policy, spanning the areas of WASH, gender equality, human rights, and governance. Throughout her career, she has provided technical advice to governments, development partners, and technical teams, and held multiple leadership roles where she advanced programmatic impact and influence in Ethiopia and more widely in East Africa and parts of Asia region. So Bethlehem, it's my great pleasure to hand over to you the moderation of this webinar. Have the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So let me start off by saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for making time to join one of the final webinars of the year. As Eileen mentioned, RWSN and Agenda for Change are presenting this webinar as part of our strategic partnership, which is intended to bring the rural water supply community and the WASH systems strengthening community closer together. So we're quite excited and delighted to be able to do this together. This webinar comes at a very opportune time because there is a growing recognition amongst development partners, practitioners, and policymakers of the need for systems-based approaches as being the primary solution to ensuring the long-term sustainability and equitability of water and sanitation service provision. So we find that the content is quite timely and relevant. And systems-based approaches explicitly acknowledge the need for a more holistic consideration of safe and universal service delivery. So today, we will be sharing 3 stories with you that highlight the exciting complexity, the messiness, and the unique qualities of thought and action required in systems leadership. And before I introduce our amazing storytellers, I'd like to share a few slides with you to serve as a framing for the stories you're about to hear. So next slide, please. Thank you. For those of you who are acquainted with system strengthening, this tool will be familiar. And for those of you who are hearing about system strength for the first time, this could be an interesting tool that you can explore and utilize to shape your approach to WASH programming along the systems lens. So what you see on the slide is a systems-based analytical tool that we also refer to as the WASH system building block tool. And the tool conveys that a WASH system strengthening approach involves taking actions and supporting interventions that are considered likely to strengthen one or more elements of the whole system. So what this entails is strengthening both the factors and the actors. So when looking at the factors, these are the elements that you'll be able to see on your left, the bright colors. They are factors such as technology, financing, regulation, coordination, service delivery, etc. And the block you see on your right are the actors. So system strengthening entails working and engaging with both sides so that capacities are robust and the system is self-sustaining. So it looks at the interrelationship between these components, the actors and factors, as key to improve the quality and sustainability of water services. So investing in just one aspect of the system, for example, you can look at infrastructure as a key factor, will not be able to address the systemic challenges undermining sustainability. So today you'll be hearing 3 stories from water systems practitioners. And while you're hearing these stories and you're listening to them, imagine which factors and actors these stories are highlighting and touching upon. Next slide, please. On this slide, on a systems blind approach. So what I just shared with you on the previous slide was what a system strengthening approach is. It's a holistic approach of engaging and strengthening the actors and factors to affect the whole system. So our services can be sustained versus a systems blind approach. So a systems blind approach is an approach that is not holistic, that is not comprehensive, and just focuses, zeroes in, and kind of engages just one aspect of the system, such as the infrastructure. And I can use a practical example of, if you've been implementing or working in the water supply sector for a long time, how many of us have been part of water supply projects which fail to provide water after a short time? That is essentially what this slide conveys. A systems blind approach focuses on coverage rather than sustainable access to services. Next slide, please. So when we come to a systems approach, it's an approach that incorporates all the key factors, not just zeroing in on one aspect of just infrastructure, but looks at the financing, the life cycle costing beyond just the capital investment required to keep an infrastructure going, looking at the human resource component, looking at the regulation component, looking at the coordination component. So it looks at the actors and factors, looking at the operations and maintenance. So looking at all these factors as they are interrelated and essential to the provision of sustainable water services beyond the initial project period. So given that infrastructure is part of the system where different factors and actors interact, it's important to underscore that no single organization can effectively address systemic weaknesses. Therefore, delivering systemic change requires collective action. So it's multiple people working with multiple agencies, working across multiple boundaries and narratives to be able to collaboratively get to a common objective. So with that brief framing, we will now proceed to hear from our systems storytellers, and we have an amazing lineup of wonderful systems storytellers. Next slide, please. Our first speaker is Irene Guy. It's my pleasure to introduce Irene. Irene is a seasoned WASH practitioner in both development and humanitarian sectors. She has over 15 years of experience supporting WASH governance interventions in various countries across Asia and Africa. In her capacity, she has managed a multi-country WASH system strengthening program, focusing on both fragile and development contexts. The Rural Water Supply Network's Executive Committee. Irene has recently transitioned to WaterAid UK as the Senior Manager for WASH Systems and Program Partnership. So Irene's story is an organizational tale of how WHH, Weltangerhilfe, has navigated the ouch moments and the pain points while adopting system strengthening as a programming approach. Over to you, Irene.
To contribute decisively to ending hunger, water management, policies, and investments must overcome daunting challenges. Water sanitation and hygiene affects food security and nutrition through a number of pathways. This is the basis through which WHH, an agency that is primarily focused on promoting a world without hunger, made a decision to adopt system strengthening as an approach to leverage impact but also ensure sustainable service delivery across its constituent portfolios, not just in water, sanitation, and hygiene, but ultimately also through the food systems. So I will be talking about the organization's journey, but in the spirit of unpacking or demystifying system strengthening, also share with you some of our ouch moments when we were undertaking interventions in some of the countries that we are engaged in, just to give context on some of the ups and downs, but also some of the things that can go south when you're talking about system strengthening. So, what does it mean to adapt to system strengthening, and why did WHH do it? So the story started from an evidence engagement, and this was evidence of failure. In 2010, RWCN commissioned a study on the needs of the rural water supply sector, where a number of facilities were established not to be working years after NGOs had already invested in this. So WHH also realized that in that report, a number of the facilities they had supported were not working anymore. And this, by extension, triggered some internal reflections on how we could do things differently. So the journey from 2010 was about self-awareness, and collaboratively through the years, it has been learning, it has been engaging in the sense of developing tools, contextualizing this, but also collaboratively engaging with others in the sector to see how we can promote the approach in terms of supporting interventions that are more sustainable. Now, contrary to popular beliefs, system strengthening interventions are not designed from a desk in the office. It actually requires a curative process which involves most stakeholders. So, WHH journey can just give you a reflection on how long it actually took the organization just to institutionalize this. Not 100% there yet, but basically the steps that it has taken WHH to get to where it is, with now more than 10 countries engaging in wash system strengthening. So the journey, as mentioned, having been informed of the evidence of failure, triggered an internal portfolio review to set the right vision. And this led to the launch of the Sustainable Services Initiative, an initiative that was collaboratively developed by other key stakeholders, Agua Consult and German Toilet Organization, just to have a sense of what does this mean for the sector, what are the tools, how can this approach be operationalized in the context of some of the engagements we had in country. And then this, of course, led to mobilizing high-level management backup and the willingness to invest in this. This is very important. When you're talking about change externally to the sector, you have to start with your internal mechanism first, just so that you can already have the critical support that you need for this. And then linked to this is the strategic partnering that has seen us through the years with this engagement. So strategic partnering with individual agencies like Agua Consult and IRC, but also with collective mechanisms like Agenda for Change and Sanitation and Water for All. And then, of course, having this being institutionalized as an approach within the organizational strategy. So the first time it featured in the organization strategy was the strategy for 2021-2024. And currently, of course, also in the new strategy, this is one of the elements that WHH is still taking forward. And then linked to this, you need resources to operationalize this. So making a case with institutional donors and in WH case was with BMZ and having support from Viva Con Agua to support some of the institutional costs to operationalize this. So this is very important because at the time when donors were very keen on numbers, were keen on infrastructure, we needed to build a case to donors who could finance this at the beginning in terms of appreciating that it might not have the immediate outcomes or outputs that donors would traditionally be looking at, but this is a more sustainable way of strengthening the sector. So through this process, we've seen growth from 6 countries. Now we have 10 countries that are engaging in wash system strengthening. And of course, we've also seen more intentional engagement in the sector at global level, but also in regional and in-country discussions. Now, moving from an organization's intention and now to operationalization of the concept, I would like to share with you some of the tips based on our ouch moments. Our ouch moments are equated to stepping on a Lego. You know, the pain hits you like a ton of bricks. It's the same with systems interventions. Things would go south, and you have a choice on how to react or respond to those setbacks. It doesn't matter how well designed the program is or your intervention is, you'll always have your Lego moments. So when you hit that Lego, and based on some of the tips we're sharing with you, you'll need to ask yourself, will you let that pain define you or will you soldier on? So our first ouch moment is related to introducing the approach in a given country or context, and this is in reference to application of the sector assessment and diagnostic tools, referencing the stakeholder mapping, capacity assessment, and the building block diagnostic tools. So it is important to be mindful of your step. For example, for us, we applied the tools with the stakeholders before we had exposed them to some basic training on WASH systems through the WASH Systems Academy. So it doesn't matter how well you explain the tools to the stakeholders, the quality of information would be substantively be compromised if the mindset orientation through this process of reorientation around systems dynamics is not addressed at the beginning. Contextualizing the building block diagnostic tool is relatively straightforward, but it is the other two complementary tools that actually need a different approach, including timing. So when you're talking about stakeholder mapping and capacity assessment, say for example, for a general stakeholder engagement strategy and plan, the process is really quite different. It's different from having a stakeholder mapping and capacity assessment in the context of delivery of mandates, which is the core element of system strengthening. So it is important to integrate this into program activities rather than employ them as standalone tasks, which was the first Lego that we hit. And of course, a good entry point would be unpacking the sector capacity from not just from facilitating institutions to reflect on their capacities, but engaging them through collective processes, for example, on district wash master plans as opportunity for them to have open dialogue on what kind of capacities are in place for the sector and how does the sector pay for this, and then narrowing this down on what are the actions needed to take forward some of their commitments and reflecting if they have the capacities in place to this. So for example, if the role of the district is monitoring role, then we'd have to have a reflection if there's someone who can do data tracking and ask the person in place if they are already confident or if they have the capacity to do this in the coming period, and if there is need to also upgrade the capacity depending on what the sector needs. As you engage, remember small things can pack a punch, and this is in reference to your intervention design in terms of your program scale vis-a-vis your internal capacity. For internal capacities, it is important that you reflect on what you're great at as an organization as well as with your respective partners, because the skills you'll need at micro level and those you need for meso level and national level engagement are quite different. Looking externally, it's important to build coherence and complementarity with what other actors are doing, especially being very conscious or on who is on the table at given points and who is the chef at what point. This was a good learning for us in Pakistan, where we had a missed opportunity for 6 months to operationalize our engagement around strengthening coordination, because by then the priority of the district was around flood emergency response. We could have leveraged this to strengthen stakeholder engagement and commitment, but yeah, as we say, it is by engaging with the system that you learn the most about it. And then finally, talking about investing in pilot interventions that target specific actor spheres of action. This would really accelerate uptake, particularly in appreciation that in some of the countries you'll engage in, you'll still find some very strong public sector-driven infrastructure development programs, like the case for India and Pakistan. Of course, this does not always translate into achievement of high levels of basic services, particularly if you're looking at challenges related to the level of services improvement beyond basic level, inclusion of vulnerable groups, but also how sustainably the services can be provided. So our cases of well-aligned pilot, we had in Pakistan investment in the pilots for sewage treatment units for safely managed sanitation, which basically influenced signing of an MOU with the Punjab Rural Municipal Services Company on technical partnership to address elements around O&M, but also taking this to scale. But in some cases, like in Zimbabwe, some of our pilots related to household water treatment was not effectively taken up because of the kind of interest that the stakeholders have. And of course, in India, the uptake of inclusive village action plans to inform prioritization of excluded household, where we've seen impact of more than 3,204 excluded households now being connected to water supply pipe scheme as part of the government's Jal Jeevan mission commitments, has actually had an impact. So these are things that we think would really be important as you take this forward, or as you consider to engage around systems strengthening. Thank you. To contribute.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Irene. That was great. It's it's music to the ears of a systems nerd, essentially. Some of the interesting thoughts I picked up as you were sharing the institutionalization journey that WHH went through to kind of embed system strengthening into its programming approach was the key value of internal readiness, being comfortable with the unexpected and the discord, and also not relying on a neat and linear process. And these are really important, being comfortable with the chaos and the dynamism and the complexity, because they are reflective of systems leadership. So thank you so much for sharing WHH's incredible institutionalization journey of WASH system strengthening. I will now proceed to introduce our second storyteller, who is Muti Nelma. Muti is the team leader of Baseflow, an award-winning Malawian-run social enterprise, which is working to improve the sustainability of groundwater resources for rural populations to be able to access safe drinking water. Baseflow has been recognized as environmental sanitation network in 2021. Baseflow has also championed the improvement of data governance through firstly collaborating with multiple partners to create a database of more than 100,000 rural-based water points. Wow, that's tremendous. That's tremendous. 100,000 plus rural-based water points organized in a database, which makes it the largest water asset inventory in Malawi's history. And secondly, Baseflow also works alongside the key line ministry of Malawi, which is the Ministry of Water and Sanitation, to facilitate a single national management information system for the water sector. So Muti is also currently the theme lead for the Rural Water and Sanitation Data for Action Working Group. Muti's story is an interesting one. So we've just heard about an institutionalization journey, but Muti's story is different. It's about challenging assumptions. So it's about bridging gaps between philosophies and system strengthening. And in his story, he will highlight the complexities around how different actors interact and how power, politics, and incentives affect roles and expectations within the WASH space. So we're in for a very interesting story. Over to you, Muthi.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you are. My name is Muti Khema, and I'm team leader with Baseflow, a local organization based in Malawi, but also the theme lead for Data for Action group of RWSN. I welcome you to my presentation, which will be a little different. Rather than subject you to death by PowerPoint, I'll be subjecting you to death by video. I'll be sharing with you my story and experience with systems strengthening. I was talking to a friend of mine from Ethiopia the other day, and we were having a conversation around how nonprofits have this knack, this capacity, this flexibility to migrate and change words to say something different, but it's things that we've been doing for the longest time. For example, system strengthening, according to this friend of mine, used to be known as rights-based approaches because it was also looking at the system. But because the word rights is divisive in some parts of the world, systems strengthening is seen to be more politically correct and acceptable in some parts of the world. So at this point in the program, I'm sure you've been taken through the building blocks. Some people say they are 9, some people 11, some people 13. But the key point is that in every system, particularly in the water sector, there are specific building blocks that you need to address to ensure that the existing system, and in many parts of the world, that's the government system is strengthened to deliver the services that it needs to deliver to the general population. And today, I'm not going to talk about data as much as I have a lot of stories to share about data. I'll be talking about the infrastructure service delivery block of the building blocks. Because I have an experience where I've learned that has shaped my thinking when it comes to system strengthening. Because when we think about system strengthening, we often talk about frameworks, capacity, institutions, policies, practices. These are the words that are associated with system strengthening. But one thing that my experience in the WASH sector, specifically in system strengthening, has taught me is that there are certain words that we don't use, but those words are just as important as those other words I mentioned, like frameworks and policies and processes and capacity. And those other words are words like philosophy, culture, beliefs, emotions. These are words that we don't really use as often when we talk about system strengthening. But these are the things that influence the outcome of a lot of our system strengthening initiatives. So I wanted to share my experience of a time that I confronted and realized that even the system you're trying to strengthen may have a philosophy that you need to take into consideration as you're coming to do your system strengthening work. So just a bit of context before I launch into the story. Here in Malawi, the most common hand pump that is used is called the Afridev hand pump. For those of you who might not know what it is, it almost is similar to the India Mark II in some parts of the world, but it's very common here in Malawi. And Malawi has done an excellent job of standardizing rural water supply. And what I mean by that is that the Afridev hand pump is the most ubiquitous and common hand pump in rural Malawi. It's all over the place in most parts of the world. So the Malawi government, when it comes to system strengthening and standardizing infrastructure, the Malawi government has done an excellent job of having the Afridev hand pump as the standard hand pump for use. But like a lot of hand pumps across the world, across the rural world, a lot of these hand pumps break down. In Malawi, it hovers, a non-functionality rate hovers between 25 to 30% that are actually broken down. Now, there are lots of theories and studies that have suggested the cause of this. Now, for about 8 or 9 years ago, I came up with a hypothesis. And the hypothesis was that to strengthen the infrastructure service delivery building block, we needed to give consumers or water users the choice to choose the hand pump of their choice. Because if they choose the hand pump of their choice, they'll more likely own it and therefore more likely maintain it, rather than being given or imposed a hand pump technology that they may not actually want. So that was my hypothesis. So as part of this hypothesis, I secured funding from UNICEF, and we were implementing an innovation where we were going to give water users in a certain catchment area the choice of the hand pump that they would want. So there were several options, about 4 or 5 options. At the high end of the spectrum was the affidavit hand pump, the one that I mentioned, the standardized one that is very, very common and sort of high end in terms of hand pumps. At the low end of the spectrum, or the other end of the spectrum, was the rope and washer pump. So in between, there were other different hand pumps. And for each of these hand pumps, we calculated the life cycle costing to understand how much does it cost to maintain that hand pump per month on average. So we calculated that, and then we came up with a brochure. We linked up with the local government for the area that we were working in. And then we showed them the brochure. We took them through our hypothesis and what we were thinking, and they loved the idea. And they said, yes, we will support this project. So the local government were the ones who went out to sensitize the communities about the hand pumps that were available for them to choose from. And for budgeting purposes, we budgeted for the hand pump, for the high-end hand pump, that is the affidavit hand pump. So that's how we budgeted. So the local government went into the field, they sensitized and got everyone excited, and then it was time for the communities to choose the hand pump of their choice. And then we got a report back from the local government that the communities had chosen the rope and washer pump, the cheapest hand pump. And we were excited about this because we did think that cost was a factor in their choice. Cost would be a factor in their choice in terms of choosing a technology they could actually maintain without any trouble. Because, like I said, we believe that if they choose it, it means they own it and they will maintain it, especially if they can afford to maintain it, and therefore the non-functionality would obviously be lower, and then you have a strengthened infrastructure service delivery in terms of the building blocks. So that was the idea. So there were 50 communities they went to. All 50 communities chose the rope and washer pump. So we were very excited. So we got a university to come in to document it, to kind of do an independent evaluation. And when they came back with the data, I sat with the university to hear what their findings were. And it turned out that none of the 50 communities were given an actual choice. The rope and washer was imposed on them. And which was strange because I was told that they were given a choice. So I went to meet the local government. We had a meeting, we had a discussion, and I asked them, why was this choice, were the communities given a choice? Was there a moment when you sat down and kept quiet and let the communities deliberate amongst themselves after you sensitized them to choose the hand pump of their choice? Did you do that? And the local government individual said something I'll never forget. He said, the choice of technology is something that a technocrat must do. We cannot leave that to the rural poor to make that choice. That's a philosophy. It was a belief that this government individual held, and most of the government extension workers held. And now, it's not that I'm not trying to denigrate it. It is simply what they believe. And when we were doing our planning, our risk management frameworks and all of that, we did not consider or take into consideration belief or philosophy, because they believe that if it's something technical, only they as technocrats can make the choice of the type of technology that could be put there. The choice of technology is a political choice. It cannot be a social choice. That was their philosophy. We did not take that in consideration because they believe that the rural poor cannot be left with this choice. They can't make this choice. We have to make it for them. And you find that in a number, and I'm sure in a number of experiences you may have had, you find that there's a belief or a philosophy. It's unwritten, it's unspoken, but it is there and it influences the outcome of system strengthening. It could be you coming in with trying to strengthen the market system with sanitation marketing, and you want the poor to pay for services, and you're working with the local government to strengthen the sanitation market, when actually the local government believes the rural poor should not pay for services. You're bringing a capitalist system in a socialist environment. Mismatch. And this experience, oh, one last point. I'm sure some of you are wondering, but if the government did not believe or did not support the idea of community choice, that they are the ones who are supposed to do that, why did they want to go ahead with the project? That's a very good question. And one of the things I've learned in the years I've done system strengthening is that in most parts of my country, the district government will not turn away money. Even if they do not believe in the philosophy that's embedded within your system strengthening approach, they will simply accept it because the government is in a low resource environment and they will accept whatever money they can. They will rarely turn away money. Again, something we didn't consider. So philosophies influence the outcome of system strengthening initiatives. If you do not check, if you're not very careful in terms of the assumptions you're holding about your approach, what is the philosophy embedded within it? And does it match or mismatch with the system that you're going to strengthen? And if there's a mismatch, you may have to invest a lot of time in terms of sensitization, culture change, and really digging deep into how they can come up with how to get them to see your point of view. It could be you can start with a small pilot to see how it goes rather than going large scale. So philosophy matters, beliefs matter, culture matters, because every system has a philosophy, has a culture, has a belief system that influences the outcomes. And these are unwritten and often unspoken. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was brilliant. Thank you, Muti. That was amazing. It's really nice. I shared with you at the beginning the building blocks. There are things that are not written that are just as important as the building blocks understood. So that political component around understanding what's not written to shape our investment for best impact and outcome is so key. It's like Irene's story, the importance of learning, reflecting, and adapting, but it also highlights the sensitivities of the interacting roles that are there within a community, government, community, and the non-state actor, and the politics around technological. There's a lot that's actually not written on paper, and the mindset that frames development and the power relations that influence that we knew better for the community is part of kind of the embedded normative approach to development, where communities are perceived as passive participants rather than active contributors to projects and programs, and which is very key to the system's leadership lens that we are kind of keen to have embed the co-creation, the partnership, the localization components. But there's also sensitivity here. As a systems actors, we are looking to engage for a long period of time. So how do we take care of these relationships? Are we in a position to call out government? Or are we in a position to be able to position ourselves as non-state actors as providing both challenge and support roles, being a critical friend? Still lots of politics, power relations, and a manner that is in line with context for the possible outcome. Thank you. Our third and final storyteller is Tripti Rai. Tripti is the country director of Oxfam in Nepal, who we heard from Irene. And her role as country director, Tripti has been with Oxfam since February 2024, And before that, she was leading Water Aid Nepal for over 9 years. So she's been in the water sector for quite some time. Development sector. Tripti has a proven track record of developing and implementing strategies, policies, and programs that address the root cause of poverty, inequality, and injustice. And Tripti's story is very interestingly positioned right after Muti's, because her story is about empowering communities through accountability. So how Oxfam has employed the building of trusts, and how through active engagement has inspired change by working closely with communities. So the focus is on mutual accountability among stakeholders and how communities can be empowered and inspired in the process. The story is a really nice snapshot of the critical role community voice and agency has within system strengthening. And with that brief introduction, I will now hand over to Tripti. Tripti, you have the floor.
Hello and namaste from Nepal. It is my pleasure to join the panel today, and thank you to the organizers for inviting Oxfam Nepal. I will be sharing an example from our Wash and Water Governance program, drawing lessons from locally led rural water supply management. My colleague Anjila Adhikari, who is also the team lead for this work, is with us and will be available for the Q&A. The key challenge that we set out to address was that while the system coverage of water supply in Nepal was 88.6% in 2019, it was also reported that only 28.13% of the rural water supply schemes were well functioning at the time. A general trend was that 71% of rural water supply schemes in Nepal became non-functional within a few years of construction due to technical designs, capacity to operate, repair, maintain, access to limited financing, and weak governance. In finding solutions, a research was conducted to further understand why water supply systems were failing. Participatory consultations with 200 user committees from selected districts to identify the solutions to address the non-functionality challenge was a key part of the process. It also drew lessons from existing water supply management models in Nepal, and the options that were agreed was in consultation with communities, user committees, and local government representatives. In all the various discussions, keeping the purpose central was very key, getting safe, reliable, accessible household taps to serve women, children, elderly, and the most marginalized communities. The identified option was to establish an alternative management model to the water supply systems to envision strong local institutions for a strong sector at the local level. This comprised bundling smaller water supply schemes in that area, which was governed by a local water board, envisioned to be inclusive and guided by a board act drawing from the federal WASH policies, mainly the WASH Act and the Local Government Operation Act in the federal context of Nepal. The board is elected from local government, water user committees, ward village representatives, and women leaders comprise members of the board. An executive unit for operations and management is equipped with professional staff selected through a proficiency test, and the executive unit supports the board in the day-to-day operations and management of the system. In order to ensure transparency and accountability for the customer service, a complaint feedback mechanism has also been established. This is work in progress. However, some of the emerging lessons are, while initiated in 2019, Oxfam Nepal continues to work with the local boards with a systems lens to enable long-term commitment to build strong systems at the local level. The continuous engagement and participatory consultations have helped build trust and also enable adapting to the changing context. The long-term commitment for partnership and funding and the flexibility in funding have been key enablers to help test and innovate. The setting up stage was also very crucial in understanding the existing systems, the interconnections of factors, that affect local systems, people, actors, and relationships, social norms, and the political context. Almost 1.5 years was spent in the setting up phase for the management model, which has been very crucial for the progress made so far and to enable strong partnerships at the local level. And similar lessons in innovative models to strengthen local systems can be seen elsewhere in Oxfam's work. Local leadership and political will have been critical for progress made so far. Locally led has also increased the ownership and ability to adapt to evolving contexts. This includes coping with disasters, for example, the recent September floods in Nepal and the early response by one of the water boards in Benighat municipality ensured that the water supply was up and running in a short period of time. Oxfam's role in engaging local leadership, facilitation to generate evidence, consultations, resources for innovation, learning from best practices, and promoting feminist leadership principles such as sharing power and inclusion have also been quite crucial and key learning points for us. In all the processes, the actors, that are people, are in the driving seat of establishing strong partnerships and driving collaborations for strong local systems. You'll be able to find much more details, including the research, consultations, and also publications and blogs in the references that have been included in this slide. And thank you for joining us today.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Tripti. That was such a brilliant story, which highlighted the important role community actors play and their voice and their agency in making locally led system strengthening happen. So it's very critical that we're able to kind of learn from your experience. Your story also highlights how we should position ourselves as facilitators of change and enablers, while ensuring that our collaborations and partnerships with communities and other actors are empowering. So it's really nice to see that when institutions pay due attention to power relations, the ownership around investment is that much higher. And all these factors are very key for systems leadership. So we've heard 3 amazing stories, and I'm sure as you're listening to these stories, you're trying to imagine, which factor, which actor. So it's quite messy. It's I think lots of things are interrelated. So it's very hard to compartmentalize the work that is system strengthening. So from the 3 stories you've heard, which have highlighted real-world applications and learnings of system strengthening from practitioners globally, these stories convey that system strengthening is complex and it's messy and it requires a bit of courage. It also requires us to think beyond our immediate boundaries and act beyond our immediate boundaries. So based on what you have heard, so that we're able to gauge. Yes, Eileen.
Yeah, sorry, there was a small clip from Tripti's presentation that got skipped. Can we just go back a little bit?
Of course, of course.
Sorry for
happy to mute myself. No, happy to mute myself. Please go ahead.
Yes.
No problem.
को दिनहरूलाई हेर्ने हो भने चाहिँ ग्रामीण भेगमा अझै विशेष गरेर ग्रामीण भेगमा चाहिँ खानेपानीको एकदमै धेरै समस्या उपभोक्ता समितिहरू मार्फत धेरै योजनाहरू चाहिँ सञ्चालन गरिरहेको अवस्था थियो। त्यसरी सञ्चालन गरिराख्दाखेरिमा चाहिँ धेरै योजनाहरू गाउँपालिकामा सरकारले पनि बाहिरी संस्थाले पनि धेरै खानेपानी योजनाहरूमा धेरै लगानी गरिरहेको अवस्था थियो। पछाडी त्यसको दिगोपनालाई हेर्ने हो भने चाहिँ योजना निर्माण भयो, त्यसको 1-2 वर्ष योजना चल्यो, पछाडी गएर त्यसको मर्मत सम्भार गर्नलाई चाहिँ उपभोक्ता समिति उपभोक्ता आफैले पनि गर्न नसकेको अवस्थाहरू देखियो। पछाडी मर्मत सम्भारमा पनि धेरै योजनाहरूमा खर्च हुने अनि मर्मत सम्भार नगरिकन चाहिँ नचल्ने योजनाहरू सुरुमा 2-4 वर्ष चल्छ, फेरि अर्को नयाँ योजनाहरू बनाउनु पर्ने, त्यहाँ मर्मत नगरिकन नचल्ने खालको योजनाहरू चाहिँ म्याक्सिमम भएको कारणले गर्दा र वर्षुनी सरकारको बजेट पनि खानेपानीमा वर्षुनी जति लगानी गर्दाखेरि पनि हामीले सोचेको जस्तो व्यवस्थित खानेपानी सबै जनताको घरमा पुर्याउन नसकेको अवस्था आए पछाडि चाहिँ ग्रामीण भेगमा पनि अब हामी बोर्ड मोडल मार्फत जाँदा चाहिँ यो खानेपानीलाई अलिकति सुरक्षित व्यवस्थित ढङ्गले चाहिँ हामीले सबैको घरमा पुर्याउन सक्छौँ कि भन्ने एउटा त्यो हालको कन्सेप्ट भए पछाडि चाहिँ यो ग्रामीण खानेपानी व्यवस्थापन बोर्ड चाहिँ गठन भएको अवस्था हो। गाउँपालिकाभरिको अहिले साना ठुला योजना जो चलिरहेको योजना लगभग 149वटा योजना छ। त्यहाँ केही न केही मर्मत सम्हारको काम गर्नुपर्ने अवस्था छ, जुन कि हामीले बोर्डमा लिएर आउनलाई, हामीले मिटर सिस्टम लागू गर्नलाई, महसुलै लिनलाई पनि एक घर एक धारा बनाउन आवश्यक छ। त्यसलाई कम्प्लिट गर्दै बोर्डमा लिएर आउने र हाम्रो उद्देश्य भनेको अबको 3 वर्षभित्रमा एक घर एक धारा बनाउने भन्ने लक्ष्य हो। त्यति घरधुरीमा चाहिँ प्रत्येक घरमा एक घर एक धारा र मिटर सिस्टम सहितको धारा चाहिँ हामीले सबै ठाउँमा व्यवस्थित गर्ने भनेको योजना छ र त्यसलाई लिएर आउनको लागि हामीसँग 3 देखि 5 वर्ष त लाग्छ नै। विगतको दिन
Thank you. Okay, I think we've listened to the video. It's really great that we didn't miss on the video because it really captures the transition from a WASH committee managed water scheme onto being a water board managed scheme, right? That was a key component of Tripti's story. The role of the community managing their own water stability. It's a fantastic example. And we also have similar examples from other parts of the world. I could think in Africa, definitely in Ethiopia, we have various examples of water boards. So water board would be in between a utility and a voluntary WASH committee. And this is such a nice evolution, which is very key to kind of having a system for sustainable access to services. So fantastic addition. I would now like to invite you to look at our second poll question. Based on what you've heard 3 stories. So based on what you've heard from the stories from our systems change makers, and also what you already know, what aspect of system strengthening do you find challenging? Poll has been opened. Kindly vote. You'll give it a few more seconds. The options you have in the poll are linked to, once again, the different factors and some of the actors that make up the system as a whole. So what aspect do you find most challenging?
I will end the poll now and share the results. Bethlehem.
Thank you, Eileen. I think the winner is ensuring long-term funding or financial resilience. Yeah, it's very interesting. That's the first key daunting issue that practitioners find to be challenging for system strengthening. And then the second highest, which is, I think, yeah, there's two that are quite close to each other, is coordination across multiple stakeholders and embedding accountability in local systems. And monitoring and integrating climate resilience are following. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting to see the overarching challenge faced by various actors because we have quite a sensible number of attendants at this webinar. So this gives us a really good insight around informing our future learning agendas, but also being able to kind of dig deeper into certain aspects. We will now move to the Q&A session. And Eileen, I'm going to count on your support to kind of help me track questions so I don't leave any behind. And I am also observing there's questions being written in the chat box. So if it's possible to migrate them or even mention them so we don't forget. I'll just quickly try to consolidate some of these questions. So I think the first few questions are for Irene. Irene, your story has ignited a lot of interest, hence the questions. So first question is around, given your wide scope, given the fact that your work has a wide scope, what are some of the overarching challenges that cut across multiple geographies or settings? Is the first question. And then the second question is, how did you capture the changes in orientation or strategy after you learned from your ouch moments or your pain points? So how did you integrate your learning into your monitoring framework to be able to kind of, I guess, add intention and continuity based on learning and then going forward with your institutionalization journey? So link to frame to monitoring and integrating the learning into your monitoring framework and the programming work. And one more question for Irene. How can system strengthening approach in WAF contribute to sustainable services for the marginalized and underserved communities? And what are some of the strategies in building capacity of the actors, but also tackling a variety of the factors, ranging from infrastructure to long-term behavior change? So Irene, I'll hand over to you while I try to consolidate the rest of the questions.
Okay, thank you, Bethlehem, and thank you to the rest of the colleagues for those questions. So I'll start with tackling the multiplicity of geographies, particularly given like in WH case, you could see that there's a difference with the country context. India is quite different, for example, from Sierra Leone. And looking at this broadly externally, we had to first take stock of what is the pressing priority around that. So you'd find that the kind of program design we had was not like a one size fits all. We had general framing for it, but then we had to adapt to inform the implementation based on the country needs, but also leverage this also to include specialized technical support prioritization for the different countries. And then, of course, in terms of the entry point, we are able to first understand where did we have the greatest leverage point. Is it at micro level, first to show what can potentially work, and then to have conversations at the meso, which is at the district level, and then have that further taken up at the macro national level. But in some cases, we realized that the entry point would start at the meso level, first to have the buy-in for the government to actually start to listen before now you could go and even test some of the models at the micro level. So I would say that depending on your specific context, this is not like something you'd have a checklist and say, you have to do it like this, but you have to be intuitive with what is needed for that specific context that you're working in. We have a broader framing of the things you could look out to in terms of context analysis, and that potentially can help. And then secondly, the question related to having learned from our ouch moments. Yes, that contributed to some internal changes also within the planning and redesigning of the systems engagement interventions across the countries. So I would say that our first challenge, of course, was related to the fact that the framework or the planning document for the program, if you're talking about log frame, was not well designed for a systems program. So already that was a challenge. So it meant that within the implementation, we had to rethink around a framework for delivery that the countries could engage with in a way that was more agile, also with their stakeholders. So we had to introduce, again, a second layer of reflection on what they wanted to achieve through what you're calling result chains, which we had to develop, and it was informed by country-specific needs. But further down to this, we realized that to inform our adaptive management across the implementation period, we also had to come up with a stock-taking process that was more not just internally facing, but also included stakeholders having a lens at how we were engaging across the implementation. So we introduced that in the process of engaging with this to help us think through better how to improve on the adaptive management. And then, of course, linked to this also, we had to develop an elaborate outcome harvesting process that included stakeholders' feedback to us on what was working, what was not working. So through the outcome harvesting, we are able to triage which elements we should put in more efforts, or where we are not adding a lot of value, so that we could repurpose some of the engagement. And we've seen this really work, because we realized that whereas you would apply your building blocks at the beginning of an intervention, it's really important to keep updating your WASH systems analysis and continue the dialogue with the government and other stakeholders so that you could see where to have more leverage. So how has this now informed better programming? You'd see that for WHH, especially with the current opportunity to scale this for, again, another 3 years in fragile and developing context, there are a few changes that they've already considered. One, a number of the interventions in the countries have been rescoped to reflect on the strengths that WHH and the collaborative partners have. Of course, also looking at strengthening implementation in terms of staff capacity, but also the partnerships to leverage impact, understanding that the kind of partnerships you have to deliver impact at micro level with households essentially could be very different in terms of the kind of impact you'd have in terms of national advocacy. So looking at diverse partnerships to address the broad spectrum is very key. And then also strengthening the monitoring, evaluation and learning framework, which is looking not just at the result, but the processes involved in that, how we use evidence. And now new and linked to this is the introduction of an impact concept that now would have the process of learning, but also adaptation to be more institutionalized within WHH, but also to have the stakeholders looking at this differently. And of course, linked to this is appreciating that when you're talking about how you define the context, then it's not just about the work you're doing directly with the government agencies, but how do you link this, for example, to other mainstream sector processes like joint sector reviews, the Heads of States initiative as key national efforts for system strengthening. So Betty, I hope I've responded to a number of these elements. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Irene. Thank you. I'll let you get a bit of a breather while Muti and Trifty step in to respond to some of the questions directed to them. So Muti, you have a number of questions directed to you linked to roles and managing relationships. So there's a really interesting question from Dr. Richard Carter, and this question is, I guess most often we're interested in strengthening government systems. Is this something that we, non-state actors, NGOs, do to them, government, or can government realistically take the lead in their own strengthening, or at the very least be an equal partner in the process? Are there any government people in this webinar? I think that's the question to the room, but the rest of the questions are for Muti. So Muti, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, for a very difficult question. I just wanted to draw people's attention to the picture behind me. This is a technology called the play pump. Some of you might recognize it. This is what we call the play pump graveyard in Malawi. It's in the southern part of the country. This was a technology that us non-profits brought into the country, and we shoved down the throats of government saying they must adopt it, and it failed completely for technical reasons as well as for health and safety reasons. So right now, these spindles are sitting in this district further south from here, and no one knows what to do with them. And they've been there for about 7 or 8 years now. So this is just an example of what happens when, as nonprofits, again, well-meaning, we are coming in to support the government system. We come in with technologies that don't really align with what the government needs. So, I mean, going to the question that Richard has brought up, and it's really a fundamental question because we're the ones who are claiming the government needs strengthening. I wonder if we actually ask them, do you need strengthening, or where do you need strengthening in? And you find that a lot of the times the areas where the government needs strengthening is not the stuff we're interested in. We want some of the sexier things, technology, finance, those kind of things. But you find that the government really needs strengthening in very, very simple things. Like, for example, Irene touched on something really important in her presentation, one of her ouch moments, and that was an assumption that they made that the government understood the language that they were using. And in the Malawian context, I've attended meetings where people like to use the word level of service and in meetings with government, and everyone assumes the government understands what that means. When actually, when you listen to a government officer speak, they're talking about coverage, which is very different from level of service. So you find that sometimes the kind of support they need is just in clarifying what these things mean, because they may be operating off a different set of metrics. Because as nonprofits, we're always moving with the next big thing. We leave the government behind and don't take them with us. So I think this is a really important question, and I don't know if there are any government people in the room who can comment, because my observation, and again, this is just my observation, I think people from the government can speak to this, is that I think we move very quickly in front, moving to the next big thing, the next technology, the next Internet of Things, going to data. Now everyone is big on artificial intelligence. Now, we should come up with something nice, and the government should adopt this. So you're finding that we're moving really fast, and we leave the government behind. And this is why in the Malawian context specifically, and speaking to this technology, one of the reasons why the government in my country is very skeptical when it comes to NGOs coming in with new technologies and approaches is because they've had too many examples like this, where an NGO comes in and says, we want you to adopt this, but does the government need something like this, right? So really having an honest and open conversation about what the government needs and trying to understand what that is, even if you don't think it's a need. And I'm guilty of this, where we have made assumptions about what the government needs, and then it turns out that's not what they needed, and then you fall flat. Or to borrow something from what Irene said, you have an ouch moment, where it's something that's so obvious, but you are so quick to move forward to do the next big thing, when the government is still grappling with certain basic things. And I don't say that in a way to demean the government. The government in my country operates in a very low resource environment. So they're still grappling with certain things that may be considered basic, but they're trying to get that right. And just to let you know, what does a low resource environment look like in Malawi? I was talking to a district water officer before this meeting to get a sense of what that means for him. His budget, his operations budget, not including salary. This is money just to go out and supervise technologies like this, drilling, supporting water point committees. His annual budget is about $2,500. $2,500. So if you're coming in with an approach, you need to take that into consideration. So to answer Richard directly, I think some of the system strengthening stuff like this is us strengthening the government instead of the government telling it. This is an example of us to tell the government what it should want instead of the government telling us what it wants. So I think that's the fundamental problem. I think we still are holding on to the reins of system strengthening instead of the government directing it themselves. That's my position. Thank you.
That's a brilliant response. Thank you, Muti. Well, I have there's a few questions that I wanted to throw your way because they were linked to your presentation. So there were a few questions around, again, the role of government. There is a question around, is it better to tell governments what can be accomplished with different approaches or show them and let them evaluate? So by, showing them and conveying what works and what doesn't work, can we influence can we influence the uptake around different areas, but by showing them and encouraging them, influencing them. That's one approach. There was a question earlier raised by Hannah around, what you talked about your story is something that we don't talk about on the daily. It's quite rare that we talk about the philosophy of, how the world is seen, because system thinking itself is a philosophy, right? It's how we perceive the world and our role in it. So linked to that and the story that you shared with us, what are some of the strategies that you employed to be able to bring about a shift in mindsets, a shift in behavior, a shift in knowledge? So what are some of the kind of the implicit approaches or explicit approaches? There are a few more questions linked to hardware and technology. There's a question on linked to the hand pump. How do you ensure that O&M for hand pump, how do you ensure that it's realized? It is a community role to conduct troubleshooting for hand pumps when there's failure. So thoughts on that. And lastly, I think linked to the philosophy. So whose philosophy should we be mindful of? Is it the partners or the users? So, and what's the role of stakeholder analysis? This is really fit in the system because the system is there even before we arrived. And that level of humility is so important. And it will continue to be there long after we leave the scene, right? It's just the level of functionality that we're trying to affect in a positive manner. So, it'd be really nice to hear your thoughts on those things. And lastly, for you, thanks for sharing your experience in Malawi. Can you explain a bit more why all communities choose a less robust technology, which is the ROM pump, instead of the AfriDev? And also, do you have an indication of functionality of the ROM pump in Malawi? So we're getting a bit into the weeds, but it's still an interesting question. So over to you, Muti.
Yeah. I'll just speak very quickly to the question about why communities are going with a robust technology rather than something more robust. In the example I've given, our assumption was that cost was a factor, and we kind of thought it was. But because of the influence of the local government in terms of saying we chose for them, so we imposed the technology on them, it's very difficult to say based on the work we did. But I think based on just basic common sense, cost is a factor when people are deciding what technology they take on. And this is something that's becoming more apparent as we're having solar-powered pipe systems across most of my country. They're sophisticated, they're sexy, but they're failing. And a lot of that is because of the complexity that comes with the system. And part of that complexity is the financial piece. So I will probably say that for now. I don't have the data in front of me, but if you want to have a conversation around functionality of these different hand pumps, we can have a conversation. Interesting. Whose philosophy is it? I think the point that you raised, Beth, is that there's already a philosophy that exists. There's a philosophy that already exists when you're coming in. Other organizations have come in and done things, and they've learned lessons and learned experiences. When I joined LinkedIn about 8 years ago, I used to have a lot of requests from people saying, I want to bring in my technology. I want to try this. I want to try that. My response was always the same. Have you learned from what other people have tried and failed at doing? That was always the response. And since then, nobody messages me anymore. But that's really important to understand what have other people tried and why did those things fail. So really spending time, a lot of time, digging into that. And when you dig into that, that's when you understand what is the philosophy that led to it. In my presentation, I talked about sanitation marketing. Sanitation marketing is something Malawi has been pushing now for quite some time. And the example I gave about bringing a capitalistic philosophy into a socialistic environment is based on an actual experience I had where the local government said, we don't believe the poor should pay for services. So really providing the space, and I think this, so whose philosophy should it be? I think it's a process of negotiation. I think you should not be arrogant in thinking that your idea, your philosophy is the best philosophy, because trust me, you will get frustrated. It's important that you need to find a place to a kind of I don't want to say middle ground, but to negotiate a space where you can get something done along the lines of what you're hoping to achieve, but it has to be linked to what the government also wants. So at the end of the day, actually, honestly, what should be the principal focus should be what does the policy say? What does the standard say? Because the philosophy is unwritten, it's unspoken, it's not documented anywhere. But when you focus your initiative on this is what the policy says, this is what the standard says, and we're trying to help achieve this, what is limiting you from achieving that? And really dig deep, honestly, and provide the safe space for them to say honestly what that is. Because a lot of the times I think we think we're providing a safe space, but we're not. We're very fixated on achieving, ticking a box and getting to the end of the workshop, instead of really trying to say, can you tell us what you really honestly think? So the philosophy that should win out should be a negotiated one, but with which the partner, the government, should be the driver of that, should be the primary focus of that, so that it's a negotiated philosophy for them. Hannah's question about shift, approaches that have worked. I think I've touched on that in a little way. It's really, this is something I've done with the government here, which I do, and it seems very obvious, but it actually has made a lot of difference. I don't take photographs of meetings I have with the government. I don't. And there's a reason for that. Because as organizations, we're very big on, when we take a photo, we want to show people, look, we did this with the government. The government here does not like that. Because what you're trying to suggest is we are the ones who are influencing the government to do these things. When the government doesn't want to be seen to be influenced by a civil society organization, it just doesn't. So if you are doing work with government, visibility matters, and the government must be the first one. And when you demonstrate that you put them first, then they will take you seriously. Because of time, I will not speak to everything, because I know there's some questions for Tripti, but really I think demonstrating that, listen, this is about you. It's you that will be the face. We will not put our logo on the thing. We will not put our slogan on anything. It is you we are supporting. It's a small thing, but for like the government here, it has made a lot of difference. My organization not being the face of it, but government being the face, and me not being seen anywhere. That is really important. I'll stop there because of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Muti. There's a number of other questions, but I think it's just, by the virtue of this being so critical and so fundamental. I'll now move over to Tripti. Tripti, there are a number of questions for you. So the first question is from George. When do the organizations that seek to strengthen systems realize that they themselves need to be strengthened, and how can this be done? And then another question, in many contexts, whenever the actors are changed, the established factors do not stand as same as before, as power dynamics may change. What should we consider as factors working with the dynamism of how they change across different actors? So working with dynamism and changing roles. So over to you, Tripti.
Yeah, thank you, Betty, and thank you for all the great questions. We could listen to Muti all day. I think his stories are fascinating. I think a very reality check is that things change and people change in government, people change in our organizations. We move from one organization to the other. So there's always the acceptance of the fact that it's constantly moving. Systems are not stagnant, and also the people are not there forever. So one of the lessons I feel, which is not very easy, is to invest in continuous engagement with different actors. So we can't only be engaging one person in the government, for example, or we can't only have one person in our teams involved in this. So it's about building that cadre of people and champions at the local level, in communities, in organizations who will constantly work on this. In my presentation, I said, and I really do believe that it's the actors in all these institutions, whichever it is, in the community users or in our organizations like international NGOs, civil society, and the government. It's some of these people who are really committed and believe that change can happen. And I think that's where, we work together and a small group of people can definitely bring change. So I think it's that continued analysis and investment in terms of adapting to change. And it's not easy. I think we have to have a reality check every now and then. In terms of us and our organizations, I think Irene already very beautifully shared her story that it's really about if we are working for external change, we have to be working internally as well. So what are the pieces that we want to work? In Oxfam, we're really looking at feminist leadership principles as, some of the core fundamentals for us. We often talk about power analysis. We often talk about what role we play, when do we lead, and when do we step away. I think that's a very important lesson for us in terms of sharing the power and being aware always in terms of what we are bringing into the room and where is it that, we would be facilitating or sometimes we would be a blocker. So that's very important in terms of understanding our own role. And I just want to make a point on the government. So in the context of Nepal, we see, especially with the federal context since 2017 and a new constitution in 2015, we do see that the government is much more, active and proactive in terms of saying what it is that they need. So I think that's a really good change. And the WASH sector colleagues I see here from Nepal as well, who have joined the panel today and the webinar as well, they are all very part of that change process. So really talking also in the story that we shared from Oxfam, the fundamental thing was the model that was there was not brought by Oxfam or just one actor. It was a model that was identified collectively. And I also liked the fact that it learned from other models that were in the sector, especially, there were many models in Nepal, elsewhere as well, in rural water supply. And there are some pilots that are being tested. So also learning from others. So solutions don't always have to come from ourselves. It has to come from learning from others and also from the options that communities, as Muthi said, would like to choose. So I think that's very fundamental. I'd like to stop there, Betty, and if there's anything else, happy to have continued conversations.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tripti, and thank you, Muti, and thank you, Irene. What a brilliant lineup of speakers and storytellers we are able to have with us today. I think we're getting close. Maybe I can just share a few words. What my eco is of seeing, understanding, and thinking about the world and your place in it. It's about understanding and engaging with multiple actors, multiple levels, multiple boundaries. And it's also about taking comfort and complexity and even chaos and even messiness and having the courage to act anyways. And we're always challenged with this question, which is, how do you qualify results and impacts in system strengthening and systems leadership? And I think systems leaders sense there is progress when better ways to get things done are starting to emerge. So that's a key qualifier of success. And when new patterns arise, that's an indication that there's a course correction and we're getting closer to the ambition of sustainable universal access. But things, when change happens, things may not always be better for everyone because there is vested interest in confusion and chaos, and also the lack of a system that's not resilient and self-sustained. The key takeaways that I thought were really great from all three speakers. And if you are, thank you so much for joining us today. It's that we're able to gather joining the webinar, and we hope to come back to you with something similar next year. If you're interested to join other webinar series, here are some rundowns of webinar series that are coming up, organized by RWSN. There's one on November 13th, another one on November 21st, and November 26th. So there's various opportunities to continue to learn as a collective and join upcoming webinars. Thank you so much for listening, and hope to see you again soon. Irene, over to you. And Eileen, over to you.